You think you're tough.
They
I've
arrested
broken
her for
people better than
impersonating
you.
a seal
Talk.
until the general
Go ahead and
whispered,
try. I'm not
"Her
afraid of
mark
you."
is real." Rotor wash tore
You
across
can't
the flight
seriously
deck like a
expect us to
serrated
believe that
blade,
after what you did.
whipping
I don't care
salt
what you
and
believe.
engine
I did what
heat
I had
into a
to do.
harsh
That's
metallic wind.
insubordination. You realize
The destroyer's
consequences.
deck markings glowed
You
under
knew
the
they were
fading
coming.
sunset,
Tell me what it
long
is.
white lines stretching
go,
toward
and
the
maybe
waiting
I'll tell
Black
you.
Hawk, as if framing a stage no one asked to stand on. Formed
You're
in a
in
rigid
way over
line,
your head,
a
girlie.
squad of armed
Talk now,
operators stood
or you won't
immovable,
like the
silent
consequences.
silhouettes
And
of
you
hardened
think I care
discipline.
what you like?
Their rifles stayed
Get
steady,
on the helicopter right
their
now.
eyes stayed colder,
I'm not going
and in the
anywhere
center
with
of that
you.
rigid
You will obey the
geometry
order.
stood a
Move it
woman in
now.
a faded gray shirt, wrists locked in steel cuffs.
Where are they holding
Her
the prisoners?
posture was straight,
I know you were
almost
there.
unnervingly
Even
still,
if I knew, I wouldn't
as if
tell
the
you.
roaring helicopter, the shouting,
Move.
the pressure
That's
of
an order.
20 eyes meant
No, wait.
nothing.
You don't understand
The
what
metal
they'll do
dug
to me.
into her skin, but she didn't shift. She didn't flinch. Not even her breath betrayed discomfort. She looked like someone who had learned to be silent long before this moment and had survived far worse storms than rotor wash. Behind her, a stocky officer leaned in with that familiar blend of authority and contempt, an expression that promised humiliation before justice. His voice sliced through the air. "You know impersonating a seal is a federal offense, right?" He didn't ask to understand. He asked so everyone else could hear their own superiority reflected back at them. One of the operators chuckled under his breath. Another shook his head, muttering, "She doesn't even look like she's seen a real operation." A third scoffed, "Give me a break. A seal? Her?" The mockery spread through the line like a ripple, small at first, then widening into shared certainty. The kind of certainty that comes when people decide the world makes sense only if they stay on top and someone else stays beneath them. But she didn't respond. She didn't turn. She didn't defend herself. She simply stood there, breath even, shoulders unbowed, eyes fixed calmly on the horizon behind the helicopter. That quietness unsettled them more than anger would have. It wasn't passivity. It wasn't fear. It was discipline. A rare kind. The kind that doesn't need permission. The officer stepped closer, irritation sharpening his tone. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." She didn't. The wind ripped at her shirt, revealing a faint glimpse of ink on her upper arm, just the top curve of a symbol, half hidden by cloth. Most of the operators didn't notice, but one soldier, younger than the rest, frowned as if something about the shape tugged at a buried memory. He opened his mouth to say something, but the man beside him shot him a warning look and shook his head. "Don't. She's just a detainee." Still, the young soldier kept staring. That fragment of ink, simple, precise, not decorative, didn't match a pretender's bravado. It matched experience. Something about her stillness did too. Another gust of rotor wash slammed across the deck. The operators instinctively squinted and shifted their boots for balance. She didn't move an inch. Not one. Her stance held steady, too steady. Not the stance of someone unfamiliar with a helicopter's violent breath, but of someone who had stood beneath one, in the middle of something far, far worse. The officer noticed it too. His smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, just enough for irritation to replace arrogance. He grabbed her by the arm, dragging her a step forward, making a show of dominance for the squad behind him. "You think staying quiet is going to save you? You think that attitude is going to convince anyone you're special?" No answer. Only that same impossible calm. A voice crackled over the ship's internal comms. "General on deck?" Instantly, the operators snapped to a near-perfect line, heels locking, rifles centered. The atmosphere changed, tightened like a rope pulled taut. The officer holding her straightened, chest puffed with the eager confidence of someone ready to display his work. But she didn't react at all, not even a glance. If anything, her gaze sharpened not toward the approaching steps, but toward a point no one else could see, as if she already knew who was coming, as if she had been expecting him. The general's boots hit the deck with the heavy, deliberate rhythm of someone used to commanding entire theaters of war. Conversations died. Even the helicopter seemed quieter. He approached slowly, observing the scene with the measured calm of a man who has seen far too many situations handled poorly. The officer stepped forward. "Sir, detainee was caught impersonating a Navy SEAL. Female civilian, forged credentials, attempted access to restricted assets. We have her restrained for interrogation." The general's eyes didn't go to the cuffs, or the officer, or the squad. They went straight to her. Her chin remained steady, her expression unreadable. And then, as the wind lifted the sleeve of her shirt just slightly, the incomplete glimpse of ink became visible again. This time, the general saw it. His eyelids twitched. His breath caught. His stride stumbled by a barely perceptible fraction, small but unmistakable to men trained to notice everything. The color drained from his face, because that mark, even half-covered, Unfell, was not the mark of an imposter. It was the kind of mark that should no longer exist. The kind of mark that only one specific group had ever been authorized to carry. A group the world believed had died to the last operator. And suddenly, the entire squad understood one thing. Something about her was very, very wrong, or far more dangerous than any of them had imagined. The wind howled. The deck fell silent. The general took one step closer and whispered, barely audible, "No, it can't be." He looked at the officer, then at the mark, then at her. And for the first time since she'd been brought onto the deck, someone else was the one who couldn't breathe. The instant the general recognized the fragment of ink on her arm, a heavy shift rolled across the flight deck with a quiet authority that needed no words to declare its presence. Unsettling trained operators who rarely hesitated in the face of anything visible or known. The subtle tension worked its way through the formation like a silent electrical current, reminding each soldier that instinct often speaks before logic can assemble a coherent explanation, especially when confronted with something that feels both forbidden and familiar. The operators who had mocked her earlier felt their confidence waver as an unspoken caution pressed against their instincts, creating a discomfort they could neither justify nor ignore, while the officer gripping her arm sensed an unexpected hesitation, weakening the authority he had tried so hard to project. She stood motionless, despite the growing scrutiny, maintaining a disciplined stillness that felt too controlled to belong to any ordinary detainee, and the steadiness of her breathing suggested a woman who had endured harsher interrogations than any conducted on this deck. The symbol beneath her frayed sleeve appeared again as the wind lifted the fabric, revealing just enough of its angular lines to hint at something far older than the current chain of command, though no one had yet spoken its name aloud. The general stepped closer, with the deliberate caution of a man trained to approach potential threats without displaying fear, and his expression tightened as he studied her features with the intensity of someone sorting through lost memories buried under 7 layers of classified reports. The officer attempted to reclaim control, with a clipped explanation about counterfeit insignias used for security breaches, but his argument faltered when the general's voice emerged with a chilling clarity that cut through the noise of the helicopter behind them, carrying the certainty of a man who understood precisely what he was seeing. "That mark isn't something anyone can forge," he said, stating the words with a gravity that froze the deck, "and the number of people authorized to wear it is effectively 0. A ripple of unease swept through the operators as they exchanged uncertain glances, each man silently searching his memory for any explanation that protected their sense of order, yet finding none that made sense. One younger operator stared at the symbol with widening eyes, recalling rumors whispered by older veterans about a unit that had been decommissioned after a catastrophic failure no one was supposed to discuss, though he lacked the confidence to voice that suspicion aloud. She remained silent, raising her head only slightly, as if acknowledging the shift in the atmosphere without granting it any power over her. And the calm behind her eyes carried a depth that suggested an intimacy with violence none of the men around her could fully appreciate. The general lifted her sleeve with a firm but careful motion, following protocol for handling sensitive identifiers tied to special access programs. And when the full insignia appeared, his breath hitched with the unmistakable shock of someone glimpsing a ghost that should not exist. The mark was clean, precise, and unmistakably genuine, an emblem reserved for a deep black task force that operated far beyond conventional oversight, its missions sealed under layers of classification even senior officers were forbidden to access. According to every official record, the unit had ceased to exist after a catastrophic ambush 7 years earlier. Its surviving members declared KIA to protect national security and bury the political fallout that followed. The implications of this symbol appearing on a living woman were staggering enough to make the general question every assumption he had carried for nearly a decade. Several operators took a subtle step back, following ingrained reaction protocols triggered by contact with individuals tied to restricted programs, and their retreat held none of the mockery they had displayed earlier, only tension sharpened by the possibility that they were standing too close to something far more dangerous than they had realized. The officer's hand loosened on her arm as he recognized the shift in the general's posture, though pride kept him from fully stepping away, leaving him awkwardly suspended between obeying protocol and clinging to authority. Her voice emerged for the first time, steady and controlled, cutting through the silence with the precision of someone accustomed to speaking only when necessary. "I never claimed to be a SEAL," she said, delivering each word with measured clarity that left the officer stunned by how profoundly her restraint shifted the narrative. His attempt to protest dissolved when the general interrupted with a tone that permitted no further argument, stating that the insignia was not linked to any SEAL team or conventional special operations group, but belonged instead to an SAP-designated task force erased from operational history. The younger operator stepped forward cautiously, piecing together fragments of whispered stories about the Ghost Layer program, a clandestine initiative designed for missions too politically volatile for traditional command structures, and his voice trembled with apprehension as he asked whether her mark matched the one associated with those operatives. The general's silence answered before his words did, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the cold weight of institutional regret. "That program was terminated," he said quietly. "Every operative was listed as killed in action." The young operator glanced between the general and the woman, struggling to reconcile the official story with the living evidence standing in handcuffs before him, until the realization finally reached him with a force that drained the color from his face. "Then how is she here?" he whispered, asking the question everyone else had been too afraid to articulate. The general had no answer, not yet, and perhaps not ever, but the look in his eyes confirmed what none of the soldiers wanted to face. The woman they had arrested was not an imposter seeking status she didn't deserve. She was something far more dangerous, far more haunted, and far more significant. The wind tore across the flight deck again, as the sun dipped behind the helicopter blades, casting her in a silhouette that looked less like a prisoner and more like a survivor of a nightmare no record had ever dared preserve. And for the first time since she had been brought aboard, the soldiers realized they were not detaining a fraud. They were confronting a truth no one in their chain of command was prepared to acknowledge. A dense stillness settled over the flight deck, tightening around the operators with the uncomfortable weight of recognition that spread slowly yet unmistakably, as if the air itself understood the danger before any of them could fully articulate it. The general kept his gaze fixed on the insignia he had revealed, studying it with the grim focus of someone who had memorized its lines during briefings, reserved only for officers trusted with the darkest corners of the military's classified world. He lowered her sleeve with deliberate precision, performing the motion as though returning a weapon to its sheath, and the officers watching him felt an involuntary shiver as they sensed a shift in authority they were not prepared to navigate. The junior officer beside her stood rigidly, but the tension in his jaw betrayed a growing fear that eroded the confidence he had used to justify her arrest only minutes earlier, leaving him uncertain of what rules still applied. The woman remained unnervingly composed, her silence carrying a depth of control that made several operators feel strangely exposed, as though she had already assessed every one of them and found their reactions predictable. Her posture did not suggest defiance or fear, but rather the disciplined endurance of someone who had weathered interrogations far harsher than anything this deck could offer, and her steady breathing created an unsettling contrast against the restless wind. A brief alert chimed from deeper inside the ship, prompting two operators to adjust their stance automatically, shoulders tightening as they followed ingrained protocol, while never shifting their eyes from the detainee who seemed capable of reshaping the mood with nothing more than a controlled inhale. The general circled her with caution, sharpened by instinct, moving with the measured steps of someone performing a threat assessment on a subject who challenged the very structure of his understanding. "Who extracted you?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of a commander confronting the impossible, and the question hung in the air like a live charge waiting for her to touch it. She met his gaze without a flicker of hesitation, and the refusal in her silence struck harder than any spoken denial, suggesting a loyalty shaped through training that demanded something more powerful than truth. The officer tried to reclaim authority with a tense accusation, insisting she posed a risk that justified immediate interrogation, yet his tone faltered under the pressure of speaking against the general's growing suspicion. The general dismissed him with a sharp look, reminding him that detainees linked to special access programs were governed by rules beyond standard procedure, especially when their survival contradicted records, sealed under the highest security classifications. The operators exchanged uncertain glances, each man reassessing the hierarchy as doubt seeped into their discipline, eroding the confidence that had guided them through countless missions. The youngest operator, still processing the shock of the symbol, stepped forward with visible hesitation, asking whether she could be tied to the catastrophic incident that had supposedly annihilated her entire unit 7 years earlier. The general inhaled slowly before answering, selecting his words with the painful precision of someone walking the edge of a truth no one should speak. "If she survived," he said quietly, "then someone ensured the rest of us would never know." His voice carried a haunted weight that settled heavily across the formation, striking every operator with a realization they were not prepared to face. She shifted her gaze briefly toward the helicopter, the subtle movement revealing an alertness honed through years of special operations training, as though she had already calculated escape paths, threat vectors, and timing with the instinctive precision of someone who had lived through ambushes far deadlier than anything on this ship. 2 operators noticed the shift and tightened their grip on their rifles, stepping subtly wider as they prepared for a possible escalation. The officer attempted to grab her arm again, desperate to reassert control, but the general intercepted him with a sharp step forward, blocking the motion with a force that froze the entire formation in place. "Do not touch her," the general ordered, his voice slicing through the rotor wash with a tone that belonged to a man who had just recognized the magnitude of the threat standing 3 feet from him. The officer retreated instinctively, his confidence finally cracking under the pressure of contradicting a commander who now treated the detainee as something far more dangerous than a fraud. The general turned back toward her with an expression caught between dread and clarity, as though pieces of a long-buried memory had suddenly rearranged themselves into a shape he had hoped never to witness again. "If you survived that mission," he said, "someone needs to explain why you were never recovered." His words stirred something behind her composed expression, and the slight tension that touched her jaw revealed the first fracture in her otherwise impenetrable calm. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a precision that cut deeper than any accusation. "No one left me behind," she said. "They made sure I wouldn't return." The statement dropped across the deck like a silent detonation, freezing every operator as the implications settled with brutal clarity, and several soldiers reflexively tightened their stance as though expecting the air itself to react. The general's expression shifted from disbelief to something far colder, shaped by the dawning realization that the betrayal she referenced might intersect directly with decisions made far above their operational understanding. His silence stretched long enough for the operators to feel the temperature of the evening change, as though the truth she carried had begun altering the deck itself. For the first time since her arrest, the soldiers understood she was not simply a survivor of a classified tragedy. They were standing before the living consequence of a betrayal powerful enough to fracture the chain of command and expose secrets meant to die with her. Team. And as the wind tore across the deck again, every man present felt the uneasy truth settle into his bones. The real danger was not who she had been, but what her survival now threatened to reveal. A dense silence settled across the flight deck, coiling through the ranks with an almost physical pressure that made every operator feel the weight of her accusation pressing directly against the structure they had sworn to protect. The general remained still, his composure rigid yet strained, as though he were trying to hold together 2 versions of reality that no longer aligned, while the officer beside him shifted with the uneasy awareness that he had stumbled into a conflict far beyond his authority or understanding. She held her posture with the same controlled calm that had carried her through each confrontation so far, and the steady intensity in her eyes made several operators feel as if she were assessing them with a precision no detainee should possess. Her silence no longer felt defensive. It felt deliberate, grounded in a certainty that rattled even the most experienced soldiers on the deck. A harsh gust swept across the ship, shaking loose cables and scattering flecks of seawater into the air, adding a metallic taste to the tension while the Black Hawk's steady thrum deepened in the background. The general stepped closer, the measured rhythm of his boots revealing both determination and fear, and when he spoke, his voice carried a controlled strain that betrayed how deeply her words had unsettled him. "If someone engineered your disappearance," he said quietly, "then the threat may still exist inside our command chain." Several operators straightened instantly, scanning the perimeter with sharpened instincts, as though expecting an unseen adversary to emerge from the shadows. One of them subtly activated his encrypted comms unit, keeping it low against his vest while waiting for potential orders, following protocol for internal compromise alerts drilled into them long before they ever reached this deployment. The officer swallowed hard, realizing the interrogation had shifted into dangerous ground where political safeguards and classified truths intertwined, forming a labyrinth no junior officer was equipped to navigate. She adjusted her stance only slightly, but even that controlled movement carried the unmistakable discipline of someone preparing for an escalation without revealing her intent. When she spoke again, her voice carried the steady gravity of someone trained to deliver truth without hesitation. "The people who buried my team," she said, "made sure there would be no survivors left to contradict their report." Her words fell like weighted steel across the deck, striking the operators with a realization that none of them could immediately process, and several soldiers instinctively widened their stance as though bracing for a blast that had not yet arrived. The general's expression tightened with the painful clarity of a man confronted with a truth he had once suspected but never been allowed to confirm, and he exhaled with the quiet dread of someone recognizing the magnitude of what had been hidden from him. "Your final transmission referenced hostile interference inside friendly channels," he said, repeating the line as if it were carved into his memory. "But the data was scrubbed before reaching my level." Endre. His admission rippled through the formation with a cold shock, and the operators stiffened as they realized the general had just confirmed the existence of a suppression effort that extended beyond standard oversight. The officer attempted to interject with a shaky argument about verifying her identity, but the general shut him down with a tone that left no room for dissent, stating that her insignia alone placed her beyond the scope of conventional processing. Her gaze shifted toward the helicopter, the brief movement revealing an elevated alertness that made several soldiers adjust their grip on their rifles. She appeared to track something intangible in the distance, as though listening for patterns only she had been trained to detect, and the subtle tension in her shoulders suggested she had already identified several potential threat vectors surrounding the ship. Two operators positioned nearest to the rail exchanged subtle signals, stepping wider and bracing themselves as if anticipating a coordinated external strike, following protocol for deep black compromise scenarios they hoped would never occur. The officer, finally catching up to the escalating possibility of danger, took a step back as panic edged into his expression, revealing the beginning of fear he could no longer hide. The general leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice to a register meant only for her. "If what you're implying is accurate," he said, "then this ship may already be under surveillance." His words tightened the air like a drawn wire, and the operators felt the faint vibration of an unspoken threat lingering at the edge of perception. She met his gaze with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned to survive without any expectation of rescue, and her reply carried a devastating clarity. "Surveillance isn't the danger," she said softly. "It's the fact that they now know exactly where I am." The deck seemed to tilt under the force of her statement, and several soldiers reflexively checked their comms again, waiting for encrypted alerts or proximity warnings that might confirm the threat she implied. The wind cut across the ship with renewed intensity, and the helicopter's rotor wash flared outward, bathing the deck in a blast of pressure that felt almost anticipatory. The general's face hardened with a realization that struck deeper than fear. He now understood that her presence was not simply the resurfacing of a classified ghost, but the ignition point of a threat capable of destabilizing everything his command relied upon. The operators sensed the shift immediately, recognizing that the deck was no longer a staging ground for an interrogation, but a potential battlefield awaiting its first shot. For the first time, the soldiers surrounding her realized they were not standing in control of the situation. They were standing inside the blast radius of a truth, powerful enough to tear their command apart, and she was the only one who understood how quickly that truth could erupt. A faint tremor pulsed beneath the flight deck, subtle enough for untrained personnel to overlook yet unmistakable to her senses, and the quiet shift in her posture alerted the operators before she ever spoke. The general noticed the controlled tension anchoring her stance and stepped closer with a caution sharpened by instinct, realizing her body had responded to something beyond his field of awareness. The wind pushed across the ship with a heavier rhythm, carrying a vibration that threaded into the helicopter's steady roar, and two operators exchanged tense glances as they switched their comms to secondary encrypted channels, following protocol for unidentified scanning attempts. A soft, irregular crackle of static slipped through the comm network brief, but unnatural, and the operator monitoring signal integrity frowned as he tapped his earpiece twice to confirm the interference. She raised her eyes toward the darkening horizon, analyzing a point no one else could read, and the stillness behind her gaze signaled that she was interpreting patterns learned in environments far more hostile than this deck. Her focus tightened, and several soldiers felt a ripple of unease as her silence filled the space with a dread more convincing than any alarm siren. The general stepped within arm's reach, lowering his voice to a controlled murmur. "What are you detecting?" he asked, though a hollow suspicion already stirred beneath his composed exterior. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she continued watching the horizon with a precision that made every operator's pulse tighten. "Long-range reconnaissance sweep," she said at last, her voice flat and certain. "High altitude. Passive track. They're searching for me." Her statement hit the formation with a force no explosion could match, freezing even the most seasoned soldiers as they processed the threat implied in her calm assessment. One operator quickly accessed the ship's tactical feed, and a faint anomaly flashed across the radar panel, momentary, ambiguous, but enough to raise the hairs at the back of his neck. He looked to the general for confirmation, but the general kept his attention fixed on her, absorbing the implications in silence. Another soldier scanned the sky with a thermal monocular, though the faint tremor in his hand revealed he expected to see something he would not understand. The officer, overwhelmed by the escalating tension, took 2 steps backward before steadying himself on a cable anchor, his earlier confidence dissolving under the weight of a threat he had no training to interpret. She turned slightly toward the general, with a calm that carried more urgency than fear, and the faint tightening in her jaw revealed how long she had anticipated this moment. "They didn't expect me to surface," she said, her tone steady, "but now that they have a location, they'll move faster." Her words sent a fresh tightening through the formation. Several operators widened their stance automatically, raising their readiness level without waiting for orders, and one soldier positioned near the rail checked the latch on his carbine with quiet precision. The general's expression hardened as he processed her analysis, and the lines at the edges of his eyes deepened with a grim recognition. He turned to the nearest operator. "Initiate silent threat protocol. Full encryption," he ordered, and within seconds the deck filled with subtle motion, soldiers shifting, systems recalibrating, and the ship's internal comms locking into a hardened security mode designed only for covert external threats. Her gaze swept the horizon once more, following an invisible pattern she alone could decode, and the growing intensity in her expression revealed she sensed the threat closing faster than the ship's systems could identify it. She wasn't guessing, she was remembering, recognizing, reliving something every soldier around her hoped never to experience. The general stepped close enough for only she to hear. "Who are they sending?" he asked, though the dread behind his tone suggested he already knew. She met his eyes with a calm that cut sharper than fear. "The same unit that erased my team," she said, "and they won't leave anyone alive who knows I'm here." Oof. A cold weight settled across the deck as her words sank in, and the operators felt the invisible line between order and chaos begin to thin beneath their boots. One soldier checked the safety on his rifle twice without realizing it, while another tightened his grip until his knuckles paled beneath his gloves. The wind grew harsher, carrying a low vibration that felt like the heartbeat of something massive approaching from beyond the visible horizon. The helicopter's rotor wash deepened, pushing waves of pressure across the deck that forced several men to brace against the gust. The general's composure cracked not visibly, but in the quiet exhale he didn't intend to release, and he straightened his shoulders with the weight of someone realizing the situation had escalated beyond his command authority. His gaze shifted between her and the approaching darkness, and the fracture in his certainty widened until he could no longer hide it from himself. She lifted her chin slightly, tracking something only she could perceive, and the subtle glint in her eyes revealed the first flicker of resolve forming beneath her calm exterior. For the first time since she had been dragged onto this deck, a spark of defiance, not desperation, entered her expression. Whatever force was coming after her had found its target, but she was finished being hunted, and the shift in her posture told every operator present that the next move, whatever it was, would not belong to the enemy alone. A muted internal alarm vibrated once through the steel underfoot, subtle enough for untrained crew to miss, yet precise enough for every operator on deck to recognize as the ship's early warning sensors shifting from passive to investigative mode. The general felt the faint tremor travel up his boots and understood immediately that something beyond routine diagnostics had crossed a threshold the ship was never meant to encounter. She sensed it even sooner, tightening her breath with the instinctive clarity of someone who had lived too long inside the crosshairs of weapons designed to erase their targets without leaving wreckage behind. Her eyes lifted toward the upper cloud line, reading patterns in the air the way a seasoned tracker reads footprints in sand, and the slight narrowing of her gaze sent a ripple of unease down the line of operators. A low-frequency tone rose across the wind, too controlled to be turbulence, too deliberate to be natural, and two operators exchanged tense glances as static pulsed through their comms for a fraction of a second. One of them instinctively toggled his encryption level, then frowned when a diagnostic alert flickered across his HUD. Field disturbance source unknown. The wind carried another tremor, sharper this time, and she tilted her head as if listening to a coded message embedded within the silence. "They're here," she murmured, though her voice held no fear, only the painful certainty of someone who had spent years decoding these exact patterns. The general motioned toward the CIC hatch just as an ensign stepped out, breath short, delivering a clipped report. "Sir, long-range scanners picked up a high-altitude reflection. No flight ID. Not weather." The general dismissed him quietly, then turned back to her with a gravity that made the air between them feel dangerously thin. "What altitude?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the range. The general's answer came slowly, as if speaking it aloud solidified something irreversible. 60,000. Maybe higher. She exhaled once, not in fear, but in confirmation, and the operators around her felt a cold tightening in their ribs. Something operating above 60,000 feet was not conventional aircraft. It was a hunter. A second pulse rippled through the deck lights, dimming them for half a heartbeat. The officer froze mid-step, glancing upward as though expecting the sky to crack open. An operator, near the rail, initiated an optical sweep, his movement crisp yet tense, as he searched the darkening horizon for a signature he hoped he would not find. She watched the air above them with a precision that made the moment feel impossibly fragile. "They've shifted from reconnaissance to active acquisition," she said quietly. "This isn't a scan, it's a lock." The general's expression hardened, and he activated a secured channel with a clipped order. "SIC, bring counter-surveillance protocols online, Sky Shield and Veil." The ship responded with a subtle hum as defensive arrays powered up, spreading a faint vibration across the deck like a low growl. But she shook her head before the systems even stabilized. "Those counters won't matter," she said. "They built around them years ago." The general stared at her with a look that blended disbelief with recognition, remembering far too late that she came from the same world as the threat now circling above them. The ship's radar pinged once, then went dead, dropping from detection to silence with surgical precision. The operator monitoring the feed swallowed hard. "Sir, we lost the contact. Clean. No fade." A clean drop meant the target hadn't vanished. It had simply moved into a manufactured blind spot, the kind only deep black assets could create. Her voice slid through the tension like a cold blade. "They're repositioning for a glide path." Even the officer, usually slow to process danger, paled at the implication. His hand hovering near a sidearm he understood was useless. A metallic groan swept across the deck as the ship compensated for shifting pressure, and the helicopter shuddered against its restraints. Operators widened their stance, rifles angled upward toward the sky, in a practiced motion that conveyed both readiness and quiet dread. The general stepped closer, his composure cracking beneath the realization that the woman he had treated as a detainee was now the only person on board who understood the enemy hunting them. "What exactly are they sending?" he asked, voice low and strained. She held his gaze for a long moment, the shadow in her eyes revealing a fracture carved by memory and betrayal. "Not a team," she said. "Someone who knows me." A cold wave rolled through the formation. As the truth settled, this wasn't a neutral strike. This was personal, deliberate, surgical. Then the sky flickered. Just once, but long enough for every soldier on deck to feel the bottom drop out of their chest. A sleek, impossible silhouette crossed the upper cloud line, silent, fast, and precise, in a way no conventional aircraft could mimic. The operator near the railing whispered, "Contact," even though the word felt too small for what he had seen. But she was already staring upward, her eyes locking onto the faint outline with a recognition so raw it momentarily broke through her controlled facade. Her whisper carried sorrow, shock, and a defiant ache from a wound that had never healed. "It's him." The deck fell silent, not with fear, but with the crushing weight of a past returning in a form no one expected. And in that breath, even the general understood. They were no longer dealing with an enemy. They were dealing with the ghost who had destroyed her life, and he had just found her again. For several long seconds, the flight deck held its breath, as if the streaking silhouette above the cloud line had carved the air open and left everyone suspended between motion and shock. The general stared upward with a stiffness that revealed more fear than he intended, while the officer beside him gripped a railing as though bracing against a storm no one else could see. She didn't move. Her posture remained steady, yet something fragile flickered behind her eyes. A sudden fracture of memory breaking through years of discipline and silence. Rising with the clarity of a wound she thought had long since scarred over, the faint tension in her jaw betrayed more than fear. It revealed recognition, sorrow, and a history carved far too deeply to hide. The operators sensed the shift, though none fully understood its meaning. They only felt the oppressive weight settling across the deck, the unmistakable sense that the threat hanging above them wasn't just an enemy, it was a remnant from her past, sharp enough to wound even through the distance. A few exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether they were preparing for combat or bearing witness to something far more personal. A soft buzz rippled across their encrypted comms, followed by a diagnostic flash on the nearest operator's HUD. Doppler distortion source, unidentified. He stiffened as the reading swelled into a brief electromagnetic spike before vanishing again, a pattern he had never seen but instantly recognized as deliberate. He reported it softly, his voice edged with confusion and fear. She never looked toward the operator. Her gaze stayed fixed on the fading streak carved across the cloud barrier, tracking the craft's descent path with a precision that made the operators realize she wasn't observing it, she was remembering it. The wind snapped across the deck, lifting strands of her hair, but she didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't break. The general stepped closer with a grave stillness. "You know who's piloting that craft," he said, responding not to evidence but to the truth reflected in her face. "Yes," she answered, her voice carrying the weight of a nightmare resurfacing. "And he knows I'm alive." Several operators inhaled sharply, because her tone held no confusion or fear, only an exhausted certainty that felt more dangerous than panic. They exchanged looks that betrayed their understanding. This wasn't a standard threat. It was personal, intimate, and deeply embedded in whatever past she had been forced to bury. The officer attempted to speak, but the general silenced him with a curt gesture, then pivoted fully toward her. "You said your team was targeted," he said. "Was he the one who triggered it?" She finally broke her gaze from the sky, turning toward him with eyes shadowed by a truth she had carried alone far too long. "He didn't trigger it," she said softly. "He carried it out." The operators tensed. Even the most seasoned among them knew what that meant. Betrayal from inside a unit, especially a classified one, was the kind of fracture that destroyed entire branches of the military. One soldier shifted his grip on his rifle, grounding himself with a motion that betrayed his unease. A cold gust swept across the deck, and she steadied herself as another wave of memory surged up with painful clarity, the kind that hit without warning, sharp enough to make her breath catch. But when she spoke again, her voice had regained its control, strengthened by the need to confront the truth rather than hide from it. "He was our point man," she said. "The one we trusted to anchor us when everything else fell apart." She swallowed once, her eyes flicking toward the clouds where the craft had disappeared. None of us saw his fracture coming. And the ship's steel hull vibrated under a new warning pulse, and the operator closest to the general read the update aloud. "Telemetry disruption, high altitude displacement, exceeding safe index." The general responded with a tight order to reinforce the shielding array, though his attention remained locked on her. The wind cut colder. She folded her arms loosely, not for warmth but to steady the tremor rising under her skin, a tremor born not from fear, but from confronting a truth she had avoided for years. The operators noticed her shift and instinctively closed ranks a fraction, uncertain whether they were protecting her or preparing for the storm she carried. The general softened his tone. "What does he want?" Her answer came with slow, controlled precision, as though she needed to push the words through the weight pressing on her chest. "To finish what he started," she said, "and to erase anyone who learns the truth." Silence fell heavy across the deck, broken only by the distant thrum of the helicopter and the deep hum of the ship's defensive arrays sliding into a higher threshold. The operators tightened their formation, moving with crisp, disciplined motions, though the unease in their eyes revealed they understood the threat had already breached the edge of their world. She closed her eyes for a single heartbeat, drawing in a breath that trembled with grief and resolve. When she opened them again, her gaze had sharpened not with fear, but with the cold determination of someone who had stopped running. And for the first time since she stepped onto the flight deck, she no longer looked like a detainee. She looked like a soldier preparing to face the ghost who broke her life, and the man who had come back to finish the job. A faint shift rippled across the upper atmosphere, subtle enough to slip past standard detection, but sharp enough to make every operator feel something foreign pressing at the edge of their awareness. The general glanced toward the sensor mast as it released a low metallic groan, recognizing the sound as interference not from weather, but from something moving cleanly through their defensive field with deliberate precision. She sensed it an instant earlier, the air tightening around her with the same electric pressure she once felt seconds before her team was ambushed. Her gaze lifted toward the dark sky, and the operators realized she wasn't scanning for the craft anymore. She was waiting for something else, something meant only for her. A soft pulse trembled through the encrypted comms, a three-note modulation that shivered across every headset like a whisper sliding beneath the noise floor. Several operators reached to adjust their receivers, but she froze instantly, recognizing the pattern before the final tone even faded. It wasn't interference. It wasn't distortion. It was him. His signature, a modulation code used only within her former unit, an audio imprint designed to identify who was alive, in range, and moving. Her breath escaped in a slow, controlled exhale, and a faint tremor flickered through her fingers before she suppressed it. The general saw the change and stepped closer, keeping his voice low. "What was that?" he asked, though her expression had already delivered the answer. "It's him," she said quietly. "He's marking proximity. Ambry Sixon." Another soft vibration rolled across the deck as the ship's sensors reacted, and a diagnostic flash appeared on the nearest operator's HUD. Thermal irregularity detected, directional source unknown. He stiffened, knowing such a clean spike could only come from engineered stealth. But she didn't turn toward him. Her eyes stayed on the sky, following a point in the darkness as though tracing a line only she could see. The familiarity in her gaze chilled the operators, revealing the depth of connection between hunter and hunted, something forged long before this night. The general stepped closer. "He's communicating," he said, silently. She nodded once. He always preferred silence. He believed words made people hesitate. The officer swallowed, voice cracking as he said, "Then, what does that tone mean?" She answered without hesitation. "It means he's close enough to choose how this ends." The wind cut across the deck, snapping the flag against its pole with a sharp report that made several operators jerk in reflex. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the sound anchor her, though her breathing carried the weight of memory and dread. When the next signal hit, it came through the ship rather than the comms, a thin, trembling distortion that made the deck lights flicker. The operator nearest the general stepped forward. "Sir, CIC reports a short directional burst," he said, like someone pinged a single receiver. The general turned toward her. "He targeted you." "He always does," she replied softly. The ship's defensive arrays shifted tone, their hum deepening as they recalibrated for active shielding. Operators spread out in a wider formation, moving with crisp precision despite the unease tightening their shoulders. They were ready for a fight, just not this kind of fight. She kept her gaze fixed forward, but her posture had changed. The tension across her shoulders hinted at a battle unfolding inside her, a war between what she remembered and what she feared would happen next. For a moment, she seemed ready to speak, to reveal something she had held back from all of them. But the words stalled, caught on the edge of a scar she wasn't ready to expose. The general approached until their shadows touched. "Whatever he was to you," he said firmly, "he doesn't get to define you now." She shook her head, the faintest bitterness cracking through her composure. "He doesn't want to define me," she said. "He wants to erase what's left." Before the general could reply, the operator at the rail suddenly stiffened, tapping his visor twice. "Movement bearing 086, low altitude, controlled arc, end of sound." She turned sharply, and the air around her seemed to tighten as the silhouette swept the horizon silent, precise, undeniably familiar. A brief thermal ripple flashed across the sensor feed, confirming the craft's proximity even as it vanished into the approaching clouds. "He's making a pass," she whispered. "He's watching, studying, waiting." The general raised his voice. "All stations hold position. Do not engage." Oh. The craft dipped low once more before climbing again, disappearing as smoothly as a thought. Operators tracked the sky with tight discipline, though unease pulsed through their formation like a living current. She watched the empty sky where he had been, her breath trembling once before she steadied it. When she spoke again, her voice carried a hollow clarity. "He's not hunting," she said. "He's taunting." The general braced his hand on the railing. "Why?" Her answer came slower, shaped by a wound she no longer tried to hide. "Because I'm the only one who survived him," she said, "and he can't bear the thought that his failure might still have a witness." Her voice cracked on the final word just barely, but enough for the operators to feel the human cost beneath her composure. For a moment, none of them moved, held still by the weight of the truth she had carried alone. And in that silence, every man on the deck understood. They weren't facing a faceless threat. They were facing the ghost she feared most, and the ghost who had returned to finish what he started. A sharp burst cracked across the encrypted bandwidth, slicing a thin line of static through every operator's headset with a precision no interference could mimic. The general's head snapped up, instantly recognizing the difference between environmental distortion and intentional communication. Several operators stepped subtly closer to her, forming an unconscious barrier as though bracing for an impact none of them could see. She felt the moment before it fully arrived. Her breath tightened, her posture stiffened, and her eyes widened with an old recognition that crushed the air from her chest. Then the signal came 3 pulses, spaced with exacting symmetry, followed by a faint modulation carrying something more chilling than proximity. It carried meaning, personal meaning. The deck seemed to sway beneath her feet as the message resolved inside her memory, and she shut her eyes not in fear, but in the cold shock of hearing a sound she had buried years ago. The general stepped closer, reading the shift in her expression with growing urgency. "What does it mean?" he asked, voice roughened by tension. "It's his recall signal," she said quietly. "The one we used when everything had already gone wrong." The operators stiffened as the implication settled over them. This wasn't a threat, it was a summons. Pulled from a past none of them understood. The ship vibrated under a new sensor hit, and an operator monitoring the CIC feed called out, "Sir, short burst ingress detected on secure band. It's too focused to be environmental." The general's expression darkened. He's trying to reach her directly. She inhaled slowly, forcing her voice into something steady. "No. He's trying to pull me back into the mindset he broke." And a cold gust tore across the deck, carrying a pressure that pressed against every soldier's lungs. One operator gripped his rifle tighter, his knuckles whitening beneath his gloves. The officer stared upward, dread creeping across his face, as though he feared the next message might be something they couldn't intercept. Then another signal hit sharper, heavier, and the ship's interlink lights flickered. A faint synthetic syllable bled through the comms, distorted yet unmistakable. She flinched, the sound striking her like a physical blow. The general stepped closer. "What did you hear?" She placed a hand against her temple, steadying herself as she spoke. "My call sign," she said. "The old one, the one they erased after the ambush." The operators exchanged looks filled with shock and confusion. This man wasn't just hunting her. He was digging up identities that were supposed to be buried under classified concrete. The general's jaw tensed as anger and concern collided behind his eyes. Another modulated click echoed through the bandwidth, followed by a microsecond EM phase jump that spiked every sensor on the deck. The operator closest to the rail reported quickly. "Sir, phase anomaly. Someone's pinging a single receiver." The general looked straight at her. "He's targeting you." "He always does," she replied, voice almost defeated. The defensive arrays deepened into a low hum as they shifted into a higher readiness mode. Operators widened their perimeter, their disciplined movements unable to hide the growing unease pressing across their formation. She stared ahead, her posture revealing a war inside her, caught between long-buried memories and an old instinct she desperately didn't want to resurface. She parted her lips as if ready to reveal something she had never spoken aloud, but the words died in her throat. The general stepped close enough for his voice to lower. "Whatever he meant to you, whatever history you share, you don't face this alone." She shook her head slowly, pain cutting through her composure. "He doesn't want me to face him," she whispered. "He wants to erase what's left of me." The operator at the rail stiffened and tapped his visor twice. "Movement bearing 086, low altitude glide." She snapped toward the horizon. A silhouette sliced the sky, banking through a precise arc before vanishing into cloud. A faint thermal smear echoed across the feed, confirming the pass before disappearing again. "He's testing reactions," she said, her voice low, "watching how I respond." The general commanded sharply, "All stations hold defensive posture. Do not engage." The craft swept the horizon once more, then climbed with a haunting smoothness and disappeared completely. Operators tracked the sky with tight discipline, though every breath on deck felt heavy and thin. She watched the empty sky, her heartbeat hammering against a truth she long tried to silence. A tremor ran through her hand before she caught it. When she finally spoke, her voice held a hollow clarity that settled like ice over every man present. "He's not hunting," she said. "He's taunting." The general braced his hand against the railing. "Why?" She answered slowly, every word drawn from a wound older than her scars. "Because I'm the only one who survived him," she said, "and that survival is the one failure he never forgave." A beat of silence passed. Then she added, voice trembling with a deeper truth she could no longer hide. "And because he knows I'm the only person alive who can expose what he really did." The wind carried her words across the deck, leaving every operator in stunned, reverent silence. They finally understood this enemy wasn't a stranger. He was the ghost she feared most, and he had returned to finish everything he started. A low vibration rolled through the ship's frame, deeper and more deliberate than any previous surge, signaling that whatever circled above them had finally moved into a range no defensive doctrine considered survivable. The general steadied himself against the railing as the steel beneath their boots let out a heavy groan, carrying the unmistakable weight of a threat descending with purpose. The operators tightened their formation in one fluid motion, rifles angled upward as their bodies settled into controlled readiness. The officer near the command hatch exchanged a tense glance with the radar technician, both men realizing that the sensor's sudden silence revealed more danger than any warning tone could. Silence meant the intruder had already penetrated the ship's outer envelope. She felt the shift before the hull did. The air thinned into a pressure she recognized too well, pressing gently against her lungs like the ghost of a moment she had once survived only by instinct. Her hands curled slightly, not from fear, but from the conditioned preparation of a soldier trained to face precisely this type of approach. She raised her gaze toward the sky, her breath steady but weighted with memory. A flicker cut through the deck lights as a microsecond EM pulse slammed into the shielding field. Static snapped across several visor feeds, causing two operators to flinch instinctively. The nearest technician pressed his earpiece, absorbing a rush of corrupted telemetry before reporting, "Sir, CIC confirms an incoming vector. Object descending with intentional acceleration." The general narrowed his eyes toward the dark patch of sky, rippling with hidden motion. "Altitude?" he asked. "Unknown," the operator said. "He's dropping too clean and too fast to track." A sharp dread tightened the air as she inhaled through her teeth, her expression cracking with recognition. "He only descends like that when he's ready to control a target," she said. The officer's voice wavered. "Meaning, this is an approach to engage?" She shook her head slowly, her jaw tightening. "No. This is how he corners a survivor." Another violent gust tore across the deck as a dark silhouette sliced through the clouds, gliding so low along the ship's flank that several soldiers instinctively stepped back. The craft executed a perfect arc, its movement smooth enough to feel choreographed, leaving behind a faint infrared scatter bloom before vanishing into the night. Operators raised their rifles in reflex, but the general snapped his hand upward. "Hold your fire! He's provoking a reaction, don't give him one." She stared at the route he traced, her eyes dimming as an unwelcome memory forced its way to the surface. "He flew that pattern during compromised zone extractions," she murmured. Whenever someone tried to run before he decided their fate, the general studied her face, reading the revelation beneath her voice. "He thinks you're trying to escape something." She exhaled, the breath trembling against her discipline. "No. He thinks I'm trying to escape him. The ship's alarms emitted a short, fractured tone as the sensors attempted reacquisition, only to be overwhelmed by a precise jamming burst. The technician cursed under his breath. "Sir, we lost him again. He's mapping our blind spots." A tremor of fear moved through the operators as they absorbed the implications. If he was mapping blind spots at this proximity, he could breach any vector he chose. The officer moved toward the hatch, unsure whether to prepare an internal lockdown or external countermeasure. The general stepped closer to her, lowering his voice to keep the exchange private. "What does he want at this stage?" She took a long breath, her voice steadier than her eyes. "Isolation," she said. "Then compliance. It's how he resets a battlefield." Another sharp modulation cut through the bandwidth, clearer, heavier, unmistakably deliberate. A second tone followed, layered beneath it with surgical precision. This wasn't a proximity mark or an old recall code. It was a directive. One meant only for her. Her shoulders stiffened, and a tremor flickered along her jaw. She whispered the translation through clenched breath. "He wants me to step forward." The operator beside her blinked in disbelief. Forward. To where? She pointed toward the far edge of the deck where the floodlights began to thin, her gesture painfully steady. "There. Alone." The general stepped directly into her path, planting his boots with unshakable authority. "You're not going anywhere near that edge. He doesn't command this deck." The wind fell utterly silent, and a new sound sliced the air. Low. Mechanical. Near. The silhouette materialized again, slower this time, hovering at an angle that no longer resembled surveillance. It felt intentional, surgical, as if he were positioning himself to watch only her. She froze, not from fear, but from the crushing recognition of a man she once trusted, preparing to reclaim the survivor who defied him. A tremor escaped her chest, small but unmistakable, as she whispered the truth finally rising from years of buried memory. "He's here for me." And in that breath, every soldier on the deck understood they weren't preparing for an attack on their ship. They were standing at the edge of a confrontation he had been engineering since the day he decided she was never meant to live. The hovering silhouette remained unnervingly still, suspended above the edge of the floodlights with a patience that felt calculated rather than mechanical, as if it were studying every breath she took. The operators held their formation with rigid discipline, though a quiet dread pressed through their ranks as each man felt the growing weight of a confrontation far beyond their training. The general stepped forward, shoulders squared, refusing to allow even a shadow to challenge his authority on his own deck. She stood absolutely still, her gaze locked onto the darkness where the craft hung in silent vigilance, and her breaths grew thin and controlled, as if she were preparing for a voice she once prayed never to hear again. The wind slid across the deck in uneven waves, pulling at their uniforms with a cold insistence that hinted the night was listening. Then a sound rose through the air, not through comms but through the atmosphere itself. A low-frequency modulation vibrated along the steel deck, layering itself beneath a soft mechanical hum like a buried memory clawing its way back into her mind. Her shoulders tightened instantly. A faint tremor traveled down her arm before she steadied it, and the general noticed the change the way a commander notices a fault line in the earth before it splits open. "What is that tone?" he asked, his voice low yet urgent. Her answer came slowly, shaped by the heaviness she carried in her lungs. "It's a lock-on signal," she said. "Not for weapons, for someone." The nearest operator frowned, adjusting his stance. "A lock-on for what purpose?" She hesitated, a long, painful pause that stretched across the deck like a held breath. When she finally spoke, her voice wavered with a vulnerability she rarely allowed. "During covert extractions, this signal meant a team member had gone rogue," she said, "and needed to be brought back." A ripple of alarm moved through the ranks as the implications settled in. The officer stepped forward, disbelief tightening his voice. "He thinks you're the rogue one?" She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the cold wind wash over her before she answered. "He knows what he did," she said quietly. "But in his mind, I'm the one who broke the team." The general stepped closer, placing himself between her and the hovering silhouette. "You survived," he said firmly. "Survival isn't betrayal." Her gaze shifted to him, and something fragile cracked behind her eyes. The words formed slowly, dragged from a wound she had kept buried beneath layers of discipline and silence. "When he turned on us," she whispered, "I hesitated." The deck fell into a deeper silence than before. Even the wind paused, as though the night recognized the weight of her confession. "I should have stopped him the moment I sensed it," she continued, her voice strained. "But he was our point man, our anchor, the one we trusted without question, and in that hesitation," she swallowed hard, "he killed them." A stiff silence spread through the operators. The revelation settled across the steel like dust from an explosion, heavy and suffocating. The officer's breath caught, and even the seasoned technicians felt the gravity tighten around their ribs. "I watched him execute our medic," she said quietly. "I watched him turn on the rest of us. I watched him smile." A tremor pulsed across the deck as fragmented LiDAR returns flickered through the upper sensors, glimpsing pieces of the silhouette, but never capturing its full form. The craft responded with another modulation, crisp and deliberate, as if acknowledging her confession with chilling precision. She flinched, harder than before. The general leaned toward her, voice sharpened by urgency. "What did he say?" She inhaled shakily, her breath catching in her chest. "He said," "You hesitated again." The operators reacted instantly, some with anger, others with disbelief, all with a protective instinct they couldn't suppress. The officer beside her muttered a trembling curse, unable to comprehend the cruelty wound tightly inside the message. The silhouette drifted a fraction closer, moving slow enough to feel intentional. The deck lights flickered in a pulse-like rhythm, reflecting the psychological grip he was tightening around her. She pressed a hand over her sternum, grounding herself against a memory she never wanted revived. "He wants me unstable," she said. "He wants me to collapse back into the moment he built his power on." The general stepped directly beside her, refusing to let the silence claim her. "You're not facing him alone," he said. "Not here, not now." For a moment, she didn't respond. Her breath shook, but beneath it, something steadier rose, a quiet defiance that had been buried beneath years of guilt. When she lifted her head again, her eyes had hardened into a solemn, unbreakable clarity. "He isn't trying to kill me," she said. "He's trying to bring me in." The nearest operator whispered, "Bring you? Into what?" She exhaled a slow, painful breath that carried years of truth she had never spoken aloud. "To finish the mission he started," she said. "The one they buried. The one only he and I survived." The wind surged across the deck, rattling metal and slamming against uniforms as though the night itself reacted to her words. The silhouette didn't move, but its presence deepened, silent, cold, and patient, waiting for her next breath. And in that moment, the general finally understood this wasn't a threat, or a pursuit, or a message. It was the reawakening of a mission so dark that even its survivors still carried its ghosts. The silhouette hovered with unnerving stillness, suspended just beyond the deck lights as if waiting for her next breath rather than the general's next command. The operators held their formation with rigid discipline, though unease radiated quietly through their ranks as they sensed this confrontation was no longer tactical, but deeply personal. The general shifted one step closer to her, recognizing the weight gathering across her shoulders like a burden she could no longer carry alone. She inhaled slowly, her eyes fixed on the craft above. "There's something you don't know," she said, her voice steady but shadowed with a grief she had buried for years. "The mission he wants to finish was never designed for survival. Not for any of us." The nearest officer blinked, confusion tightening his features. "What kind of mission does that?" She clenched her thumb against her palm, grounding herself as memories she never revisited pressed hard against her chest. "It wasn't an extraction or reconnaissance," she said. "It was a containment assignment, one meant to eliminate internal risks within our own ranks." A cold silence swept the deck. The general's posture sharpened instantly, reading the meaning before she spoke another word. "We weren't sent to retrieve a target," she continued. "We were sent to evaluate each other, to see who could be molded and who needed to disappear." And the operators exchanged stunned glances, their grips tightening as they grasped the magnitude of what she had hidden. A faint thermal scatter shimmered along the starboard sensors, flickering in small waves as if the craft above them reacted to her confession. She swallowed hard, forcing herself onward. It wasn't a mission, it was a purge disguised as duty. A deep vibration rolled across the deck, rattling the railing with a reminder that he was listening. Another modulation followed, slow, deliberate, unmistakably personal. She didn't translate it. Not yet. The general stepped forward, anger simmering beneath his controlled exterior. "And he executed it," he said. Her eyes dimmed. "He eliminated everyone they marked as unfit. He believed it was loyalty. But when he aimed at me, she paused, breath trembling. He thought I understood the assignment the way he did. The officer whispered. Why would he think that? She lifted her gaze, and pain flickered through the steadiness she fought to maintain. Because I hesitated, she said. I questioned the orders, but I didn't stop him. And he mistook hesitation for agreement. The silhouette drifted closer, slow, predatory, confident. Deck lights flickered around the edges, casting long shadows that stretched toward her feet like reaching fingers. He thinks I'm the unfinished piece, she said, the last correction he needs to make. The general lifted his hand, signaling the operators to hold, though each man braced as tension coiled across the steel. The craft's underside flickered with another controlled ripple, not threatening but acknowledging. She stepped forward by a single inch, breath trembling yet unwavering. He's not here to kill me, she said. He's here to drag me back into a mission that never should have existed. The general's voice sharpened. He will go through me first. A sharp pulse struck the deck, shaking dust loose and slicing the air with a tone she recognized far too well. The craft hovered close enough, now that its presence pressed against their lungs like a tightening fist. Her chest rose with a quiet shudder as she finally spoke the truth she had buried deeper than all the others. There's one more thing, she said softly. Something I never told anyone. Oh. The general turned toward her, expression tightening with concern. What is it? She lifted her eyes toward the hovering shadow, and the night itself seemed to hold still. He didn't go rogue because of the mission, she whispered. He went rogue because of me. And for a heartbeat, everything on the deck wind, steel, breath fell silent.